Well, it's great to see you guys here today. What I'd like to do is really talk about, just have a Q&A about why do we have a Black History Month? You know, why do we remember? Like, why are we so focused on commemoration in the Western world? And how does that focus in with Black History Month? And maybe even ask the question, is Black History Month really about history? Is it really about the past? Or is it really about how we in the present interpret the past and what we can do about that? But before we begin with those questions, I just want to ask people, what is history? Like, I know a lot of people think, oh God, Eamon, we have to listen to him, he's a historian, I'm going to be bored out of my skull. What is history? Is history boring? Is that what people think is history? Or what is history in your mind? So what do people think? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know, like I think in high school sort of same thing, like sort of when you're younger, like I definitely didn't enjoy it very much, but I think now I see history more as like a collection of stories that make up sort of some big epic tale, and it's more exciting. It's more like, you know, you're watching a movie or something, or, you know, reading a book, so it's more like a big story.
Yeah, totally. History can be a story. In fact, you know that histoire, the French word for history, is story, for sure. And also, really interesting, the origins of the word history. You're a chemist, so you know histology is the study of tissue, right? Some people argue it's the same root, that histos, which means web, is also the root for history. So history is kind of a tangle of different ideas, and now some people would say that doesn't have those Greek origins at all, but some people would say, yeah, that's totally, it has these tangled things, and histology in biology is the study of tissue, and history is the study of those human interconnection. And history, unfortunately, is taught so many ways poorly. Like, how do you mark somebody in high school on history? Well, of course, you're going to say, did you get that date right? Did you get that fact right? That's easy to mark. You know, you can go through your class very easily. But I don't know if those are the right questions. You know, those are the what questions, the how questions, the who questions. What question do you think is the most important in history?
Why maybe?
Yeah. You know, what do you think?
Are we repeating ourselves?
Yeah.
Because I've often found that like history is foundational. And like when I was new to Canada, I didn't know a lot about Canadian politics. Especially right now, I find myself at a loss when I see things happen. And what's really helped me is going back into history and seeing the way Canadian politics have played out and saying, oh, this isn't new. This is actually really embedded in stuff that's been happening for a long, long time. And if we don't know these things, then often we are confused at the state of affairs, and then the apathy sort of takes over. But like knowing that there's a history, that there are people who have like fought against oppression, shows that it doesn't have to be this way all the time.
You're totally right, and I think, but actually both of you have hit it both on them. What we're looking at is the context of the past, the why did things happen. In fact, it doesn't matter necessarily that it happened in 1867 Confederation, or that Sir John A. Macdonald was the first Prime Minister. Why was there Confederation? Why was Sir John A. Macdonald the first Prime Minister? Why did those injustices happen? And as you say, why are they reoccurring? And what can we do about that? So I think for me, one of the big questions about history is why. And I think that's the one that promotes understanding. No other question promotes understanding as much as why. And I think two other things we want to think about history before I get to my next question is that history is based on selection. You can't tell the whole story. Sometimes it's pretty boring. Sometimes you try. And if you try to tell the whole story, people's eyes glaze over. Or if you have a plaque, you can't keep writing when the plaque ends. Or if you have a history book and you have 50 pages, you can't write 51 pages. So you have to select what goes in that book. And just by the natural process of selection, other stories, right, other whys get dropped to the side. And I think sometimes that can be problematic. And the other interesting thing is that history, we talked about, you know, possible Greek origins of the word. History, in the earliest sense, meant the written record. So you hear of prehistory, right? Prehistory is all about the idea of what happened before the written record. And then history, when civilizations became literate and left a written record, that is history. Now, of course, we don't think that clear-cut anymore about history anymore, but that legacy carries on, that only literate peoples have history. Oral histories seem secondary. What about cultures that may have had an oral tradition but weren't able to write it down? What about slave cultures, for example, where not everybody could read or write? What about First Nations or indigenous cultures that had oral traditions? We in the Western world have kind of put to the side histories that aren't written. And so we need to address the issues of selection, of history that written and unwritten, and that why question. So I'm going to ask you another question, because I've been blabbing on too much. Is there a difference between history and heritage? When I promoted Black History Month here, I didn't call it Black History Month, I called it a month of Black history and heritage. What's the difference? Is there a difference?
I sort of see heritage as more culturally, like there's more of a focus on cultural heritage, whereas history is just facts for me.
Yeah, fair enough.
That happened.
I think a lot of people see that too. Does anyone else have, or have ever thought of this difference between history and heritage? We're just about to start Heritage Week in Ontario, not History Week. The official provincial week that celebrates history is in Black History Month, and they call it Heritage Week. Why? Because I think a lot of people believe, like you do, that heritage talks about a connection, a reciprocity with the past. This idea that, you know, there are traditions, there are legacies that affect us today. Whereas history can be important, but is almost encapsulated in something of the past. So to make history more engaging, a lot of people call it heritage. So why do we celebrate Black History and Heritage Month here in Canada? We talked a little bit about this before. I mean, why do we celebrate Black History? What's the point?
I think it kind of like goes from something you were just saying, that we have to choose what stories we want to tell, because you can't always tell every single thing that happened. That's too much. So sort of Black history or heritage is something that maybe tends to get sidelined in favor of other stories being selected to share those stories instead. And sort of Black History Month is a chance to bring those sideline stories a bit more to the forefront and think more about them.
Yeah, totally. Some things have, as you said, been put on the side. We've selected not necessarily an evil, there's some sort of evil historical overlord that says, I'm sorry, that history is not good enough. There are other histories that have appealed more, and some histories have been pushed to the margins. And something like Black History Month gives you the opportunity to take things that have, some things that have been at the margins, and bring them back into the front and center. Right the wrongs of selection that have happened in the past. Any other thoughts about, yeah?
I just think it's problematic sometimes, though, to just designate a month. It goes to show how little Black history is integrated into every aspect of education, whether it's in university or in high school, because in grade 10 history, when you learn about, you know, Canadian history, we spent a very small segment learning about Japanese Canadians and how they built the railroad. So there's this heritage of people who helped build the backbone of this country, yet there's no month for them, but there's no celebration about them. And like, I have to take specific courses like African American literature in order to learn about like Langston Hughes and all these amazing people who've changed my life, but I literally have to go into very compartmentalized aspects of education to learn about them, when in fact it should be, you know,
interwoven.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
no, I totally understand. We commemorate to seek forgiveness sometimes, but we commemorate also to not to forget, right? There's a constant battle against forgetfulness, and sometimes we commemorate to shame or to make sure people realize some past injustices. So there's a big continuum, and depending on what part of that continuum, I'm not saying one is right or wrong, but there's multiple uses. Some people commemorate because they just like old things, right? They like nostalgia, or they like, you know, they long for an era which was simpler or better. For me, I don't think there was ever a more simple era or a better era. Probably a well-remembered era, but not a better era. And so people remember these things. So how do you commemorate? What are the things you do to commemorate?
well, like, if I'm going to talk about Black History Month specifically,
Sure.
yeah, I took it upon myself that, like, even though I don't identify as like being Black, there's so many things that have come out of the culture that have shaped the world, and the way I commemorate that is I dedicated like February to listening to you know, Motown and like jazz and all this, like it's like a re-education almost of this culture, but it's a celebration too.
Mhm.
So I think that's really important in commemorating, not just saying like this person was important and this is what they did, but it's just like, how can we relive that excitement again?
I totally agree, and that goes back to the why again. You know, there are some institutions in Canada that do what I call the name and shame of the past. They'll give out surveys and ask who's the first Prime Minister of Canada, and then they'll get them back and they'll tut and say, oh, kids are so stupid today. Only 40% knew that Sir John A. Macdonald was the first Prime Minister, and I think that's not the point, right? Again, it's that why question. Why was he Prime Minister? And with you too, what were the influences? Why is there jazz? What influences led to jazz? Why is there Motown, right? Why was Motown popular? Those are the kind of questions that really give us understanding and bring out, and that's why commemoration can be good, because it's that kind of thing that triggers, that understanding, right? And so commemoration can be a birthday party. It could be a plaque, right? It could be written in stone, literally, something written in stone. It could be a song. You commemorate, a battle or an event through words. How many songs do we know of that commemorate an event happening, right? Either love or loss or something like that. It could be a gravestone, right? It could be that type of a personal commemoration. Or it could be something as large as a World Heritage Site, like L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, or Quebec City, or the Great Pyramids. It could be something that large, or it could be something as small as a locket with a personal kind of sense. These are the ways we commemorate things. So now that we're in Black History Month, what are the best ways to commemorate that past, in your mind?
I think a lot of Canadians, to be honest, don't know a lot about Black history in Canada, especially. I think, personally, I know more about Black history in the States, not in Canada. So I think one way, sort of individually, you could commemorate is to try and learn more about it. So, reading or listening to programs on the radio, or even coming to events like this.
Yeah, that's one of the other ways that people are.
I think that as a cultural studies major, I say this a lot, but I feel like discourse shapes the way we are and our culture. So as young intellectuals, having discussions like these really redefine what it is to have Black History Month. Even debating whether it should be a month or a year, but to really make it our own. I feel like in the future, the more we learn, the more we educate ourselves, it's going to be more defined.
Yeah, for sure. Other thoughts about it?
And just much like Ivy just said, sort of focusing on the Afro-Canadian experience and the Afro-Canadian history in Black History Month in Canada. Acknowledging the people in the States, but sort of having a more Canadian spin on it. So having activities that focus on the Black Canadian experience and teaching that in schools.
Yeah, exactly. Spreading the word, and that's part of it. That Black History Month. One of the greatest things is to get that word out there, because we're so close. It's not just Black history, right? It's everything in Canada. It's like Trudeau said, we're sleeping beside the elephant. Everything American, any twitch it makes, we know. And so, if from pop culture to other forms of history, and that we always hear the American version. So we have to work doubly hard to get out the Black, history version for Canada as well. I like to say that I'm a historian and that I work in the past, but I don't live in the past. And I think for me, history is at its best when we connect it to the present in that heritage form. I think the biggest danger of Black history or any history is what I felt as a kid, because at first, when I first heard about the Black experience, especially slavery, that Black experience in North America, I felt incredibly guilty. And that guilt kind of clammed me up. I didn't want to talk to anyone about it because I just felt horrible about it. And then I went to high school, and they told me about Josiah Henson and the Underground Railroad, and there was no slavery in Canada, and we're awesome here, and then I didn't feel guilty anymore. So history made me feel great, and I packed it in a little history box, and I put it on a shelf and said, aren't we great as Canadians? And then I went to university, and somebody kicked that history box right off the shelf and said, that is the biggest load of crap. We had slavery until 1834. Even though they say Upper Canada didn't have slavery, there was still a grandfather clause, so slaves were still in Upper Canada. All these types of things. We had all these negative things happening, and I realized I was using history as a crutch. And I think that's the biggest danger in Black history or anything, is to say, we feel good about ourselves because that's part of the past. As soon as history remains in the past, then I think we're in danger, totally in danger, sometimes of repeating it, but more importantly, danger of forgetting it or even giving a false impression of who we really are. Any final thoughts about our own personal experience with history and through the Black history perspective, or anything about commemoration or that? Any final thoughts? Well, thank you so much for participating today. This was fun.
Thank you.